Okay, so I have a new project that I wanted to announce to you, and I think you'll really enjoy it. You can probably tell from the title that I'm a co-host of a podcast now, and I'm really excited about it. The reason I didn't say I started a podcast is that I actually joined a podcast that had already been started as a co-host, and the podcast is called Develop Yourself. So I've joined my friend Aaron to do this podcast. Aaron has started several coding boot camps, and in the show, we're going to teach you everything you know in order to land your first developer job. And that includes your skills, developing your network, developing your mindset, and everything else that goes along with that. And considering that this channel is targeted towards people who are either switching careers or are towards the beginning of their career, I think this podcast is a natural fit for you guys out there that like the content that I'm already producing. But even if you've had your first job or you're more mid-career, I still think there's going to be a lot in the podcast that will be super helpful to you. So with that said, I'm going to put the link in the description, so feel free to go and check it out and subscribe and let me know what you think. With that in mind, in this video, I also wanted to talk about my reasons for co-hosting the podcast and how it fits into my self-employment. Basically, why is this something that I'm choosing to dedicate time and effort to when I could be pursuing other things that might help my self-employment situation? So I wanted to break things down, and I've got 6 reasons for doing this podcast that I wanted to share with you right now. Okay, so the first reason I'm doing this podcast is that it's a small bet. And this terminology, small bets, comes from Daniel Vassallo. I've mentioned him a lot in the past on this channel, and I even took his cohort-based course last fall, which was called Small Bets, the course. Okay, so the things that make this a small bet are that it has a capped input. So basically the only thing that we have to do is put the time and effort into making the episodes, as well as a few pretty cheap software subscriptions. So it's not like this takes a ton of money or a ton of time to do. It's also a small bet because it has a capped downside. So if we put out an episode and nobody listens to it, it's totally okay. It's not what we want, but it's not gonna wipe us out if people don't start listening to the podcast. The third quality about the podcast that makes it a small bet is that it makes time our friend. So it's not like the podcast has to succeed by a certain point. We just make the episodes, put them out on the internet, and this thing can succeed slowly. People can find the episodes, our audience can grow over time, and we're not under pressure to have something succeed by a certain deadline. So that's reason number 1, it's a small bet. Reason number 2 is that the podcast is a serendipity generator. This is also an idea I learned from Daniel, but the basic tenet is that once we put these podcast episodes out onto the internet, anybody could stumble upon them. And that means that the podcast could generate unexpected connections or opportunities. It's also a potential source of new ideas and strategies. So I could find a growth tactic on the podcast that I might be able to apply to YouTube and vice versa. And so I think there's kind of a nice synergy between doing different types of content, and you can learn things that you can apply to both domains or in one domain to the other domain. So I'm really excited about that. And because the podcast is a serendipity generator, it opens us up to ideas and connections that we might not have otherwise. Serendipity is essential for coming up with new ideas, growing your network, and becoming in general more robust. And so I'm excited that the podcast is such a great source of serendipity. That's a big reason why I chose to do it. My third reason for doing the podcast is it's fun. So far, I've found the episodes to be really exciting and energizing. Another fun reason for doing the podcast is it's an excuse to talk to people that I look up to. So there's a bunch of people online that I've either wanted to meet or talk to, and having a podcast is a nice excuse to reach out to people and to hopefully chat with them. I also get to chop it up with Aaron, who is a super interesting guy and who's had a lot of formative experiences starting and running coding boot camps. And so I think there's a ton for me to learn from him and for you to learn from him. And so that's another really appealing and fun reason for doing the podcast. My fourth reason for doing the podcast is it just makes sense. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I think there's a really big overlap between the podcast audience and you guys. And that's because the content is focused on people in the beginning to mid stages of their career. And so given that I've already done a ton of thinking and made a bunch of content for you guys, I think it just makes sense to be able to bring some of those ideas from here over to the podcast and maybe vice versa. In addition, both of us have been making content that is well positioned for people that would be interested in the podcast. And so Aaron can also bring over the content he's been creating on LinkedIn and hopefully generate some new episode ideas or just good conversations to have with the people that we do have on the podcast as interviewees. Basically, there's a synergy between the content that we're already creating. My fifth reason for joining the podcast is that it's a way to provide value. So between the two of us, we have over 10 years experience doing software engineering and training new developers. And so I think we have a real shot at being one of the best pairings out there as far as helping people that are towards the beginning of their careers. Providing value is just such an important thing online. And so the fact that we have an opportunity to do so in an area where we have a lot of expertise is great, and it just makes a lot of sense. It's a great opportunity. And my last reason for joining the podcast is that podcasts have never been more popular than they are today. This kicked off, as you may know, in 2014-ish with Serial, and now there's podcasts for everything. There's business podcasts, there's coding podcasts, there's true crime podcasts, and scripted narrative fiction. There's anything you could think of. And just looking at what the big companies are doing, like Spotify buying up tons of podcasts and podcasting studios, buying Joe Rogan, buying Call Her Daddy, buying Gimlet, it's just clear that this is going to be an important space for years to come. And so I want to be in those kinds of spaces where there's a lot of growth potential. And I think a lot of people may say, oh, podcasts are saturated. But the thing is, people are always going to say, oh, that's over by now, that's oversaturated. I'm sure people were saying that about YouTube 5 years ago. And look, it's only grown, and I think podcasts are only going to grow, and so I think it makes sense to have a podcast. As Charlie Munger says, fish where the fish are, and that's what I'm trying to do, and so I think it makes sense from that perspective. So those are my reasons for joining this podcast in 2022. Again, the link is below. If you're still here, you'd probably like the rest of my channel, which focuses on software engineering and self-employment, so consider subscribing and listening to the podcast. Regardless, thanks so much for being here. Remember, stay hungry, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one.